Do I still look fiercely handsome? No response. That's unnerving. You have to be positive, you will.
You look good.
Okay, fine.
Okay, now I wanted to ask you about Joyce Randolph, who we hadn't mentioned, and also the character of Trixie and how you incorporate her.
Okay, Joyce was a blessing. She was always in good spirits and very competent. I think we did a disservice to her character. We didn't develop it as much as we should have, and a possibility that it was a victim of the limited time we had to address the major issues, story, and plot line and jokes. But I think of the four, she's the least defined, and we never sat around and said, wait a minute, we can rectify this if we spend a little time investigating her character, her interests, her lifestyle. So we relied heavily on her for information and exposition, and that's awful tough on a performer. But she was an intrepid performer and a buoyant spirit, so she kept the harmony alive on the set.
Now, The Honeymooners as a series was only on for one season.
The 39.
Yeah, why did that end?
Because it didn't do well. I think it didn't do as well as anticipated. I think, as often happens, if you would give some respite, a period of time off, and then come back, you'd be most welcome because people would appreciate what they don't have. I think what happened there is that they were used to the hour form. We became a half-hour show, and we didn't capture the audience attention, or the numbers weren't equal to what the numbers were before. If you give credence to numbers, and by then the industry was beginning to do that and having a reverence for marketing research, something must have told them the interest in the Honeymooners was diminishing. Of course, it turned out to be wrong, but by then an egregious error had been committed.
Do you remember how you learned that it was going to go back to the variety format?
I wasn't with the show then. I had left after 39. My decision coincided with, I guess, whoever canceled the show's decision. I felt I had done the Honeymooners and done it as well as I can, and I should be on to something else. And I was being recruited by the Phil Silver Show, and I thought that would be an excellent opportunity.
Before we get to that, there's a question we always ask people we interview regarding the industry blacklist that was occurring in the 50s, sort of an outstretch of McCarthyism. Were you affected by that, or did you know anyone who was affected?
No, I probably was affected by it, but indirectly. Marty and I were. There was a team writing Abbott and Sell comedies who were accused of being communists and blacklisted. And we were hired, I think, as their replacements. We didn't know that at the time, and I can't think of anything subversive that could possibly show up in an Abbott and Costello film. So it was the height of absurd fear, unjustified acts. Really, there should be some way that those people who discharge people summarily could be sued. One of the writers went back into the industry. The other, I understand, opened a restaurant in Phoenix. Could never re-enter the business. So I was really on the periphery of all that abysmal behavior. I had some friends who were personally affected by it, but they were all courageous and defiant and gifted. Carl Foreman being one of them, who went to Europe and reestablished his career and came back triumphant.
Were there television people that you knew? Was it a conscious thing?
No, the television that happened just prior to my entering television, when Pert Kelton, who was the original Alice, was blacklisted. and Jackie fought for her. Very admirable, and wanted her, and they made it a deal-breaking demand.
How did you come to hear that?
Because when I came there, all the people were saying, whenever Jackie was gratuitously denigrated, attacked, someone come to his friend and said, how many people would have stood up and done the battle he did, for an actress who had been accused. And at the time, it was guilt by accusation. There was a heinous magazine, Red Channels. Do you know anything about that? Have you talked to others about that? Where I think it was a grocer in Rochester, New York, who gratuitously listed people he thought were communists and circulated the magazine to the networks, and they reacted without investigating. Ultimately, it's an ironic but possibly foreseeable fact that every one of the accusers, the major accusers, went to jail. Yes.
All right, getting back into it, you had mentioned that you then started to work for the Phil Silvers Show. Did you seek them, or did they seek you?
I played in a card game, and among the players was Phil Silvers, who was an old friend, and Nat Hiken, who did the show, and Artie Hershkowitz, who was Nat's attorney. And they kept saying to me, when are you going to come join the show? And after one night, Nat and I walked home. We lived in the same area. And he said, I'd like you to come on and take my place. I said, well, he said, I want to go on to do a show called The Great Montague with Monty Woolley, and I think you'd be the ideal replacement. Well, that was while I was still doing the Honeymooners. So when I decided what to do, I called Nat and said, is the offer still standing? He said, yes. And he seemed very pleased by it. And I left what at that time was my best experience in writing and went to the Bilko show, and it may have been my most humbling experience. When I worked with Nat, I had assumed that I could write anything. I had just come off this monumental success. I felt fully confident, but working in Nat's presence, I realized that he had a skill and a talent for what Phil Silver's character Bilko did that I did not. And I didn't have that, his rhythms, his understanding. He and Phil were synonymous. The compatibility was astonishing. And try as I would, I didn't feel my scripts were the equal of what Nat was doing. I worked with Tony Webster, and when Nat did a polish, it was infinitely better. And we won an Emmy at that time with our scripts, but I went to Nat and said, I'm not your replacement. In fact, I don't think you should leave. And he said, no, it takes time. He was very encouraging. But I felt like a hidden, and there was a melody, something involved that I didn't hear. And I would see a rewrite, as I said, and succinctly Nat would say what I said in many, many words. And the synchronicity between he and Phil was to me the reason the show was working. And I persistently pursued him, and he tenaciously continued to tell me I was the heir apparent. And then an offer came for the Steve Allen show, and I went to Nat and said, I would love to do this show for a number of reasons, which I will, if you want, explain to you. But if you sincerely want me to stay, I will. But my feeling is you would have left to do The Great Montague a long time ago if you felt comfortable with me or really want to do the other show. And he said, you're right, go ahead and do the show. And I said, thank you.
So you were on the Phil Silvers for one season?
Yeah.
And how did can you explain a little bit how the show or the premise capitalized on Phil Silvers?
Well, you remember I talked earlier about Phil's unique expressions and his attitude and he was a huckster. He was always on top of every situation, but within you sense his character, you sense the desperation. So that what had to happen was the fast talk had to be filled with specious logic, but at the moment seemingly very sensible, and it had to be filled with jokes. He had the perfect con, and somehow Nat and he sang the same songs, or the same rendition. And so Bilko was his best when he was talking his way in or out of trouble. I think we did some passable shows. What I'm saying to you is that Nat's polish was always a quantum leap ahead. But it was very beneficial to me in the end, because I realized you can't write everything equally as well. There are things at which you excel, and others there are going to be better people better suited to that work, that moment, that time, that idea.
Do you remember one or two of the shows you did?
I remember doing one that I liked very much. Maurice Gosfeld, who played Doberman, had a face that looked like it had been trampled upon. And he was petite, if you remember. That's a generous word. He had an attitude which was also quite funny. He was like, you felt, given this choice, you'd much rather appear in Shakespeare. And so we felt the storyline we developed for that, Tony and I do, was that the Army no longer was going to hire male models posing as soldiers for the recruiting post. They're going to do it on a democratic process. And whoever scored the highest became the recruiting poster. And Doberman got the highest score. And nobody had the heart to go forward. This man on the recruiting poster would lead to a decline. It couldn't possibly be an enhancement. But he had won the democratic process, so there was only one person they felt that could challenge this, and that was the general who had allegedly said nuts in Belgium. Had withstood a German attack withstood a German attack and refused to surrender. So they go to get that general, and what we had to find, and did find, was a tall version of Doberman, a man who looked exactly like him. Turned out to be a chief naval officer in Florida who came, and we dressed him as a general, and they brought Doberman in to plead their case, and saw the general and said, forget it, and Doberman went on the recruiting poster. Yeah, so I remember that show in detail, because I thought that was well done.
So you make the transition to the Steve Allen show. What did Steve Allen know about your background?
Well, I wasn't hired by Steve Allen. I was hired by NBC. The Steve Allen show had been on for 4 weeks on Sunday night. He had brought the late night show format to Sunday night in prime time. It wasn't working. He only had Louis Nye there. He had two great writers in Herb and Sergeant Stan Burns, and of course Steve's wit and unique personality. But the show wasn't happening. So I was hired by NBC to change the show, to make it work. And I said, how long do I have? And they were surprised by the question. They said, till the end of the season. And this was November. The end of the season was in June. You realize today I would have never gotten that job, because the Steve Allen show would have been canceled, or I would have had 8 minutes to change it. Well, with that much time, I knew what I wanted to do, and that was to add cast members and develop additional writers who felt, as I did, about comedy. and that meant searching for them, seeing shows, trying to recognize their abilities despite the formats.
So what was your title on the show?
I was head writer and director of comedy.
So who were some of those people that you hired?
Well, first, the performers, we got Don Knotts, Tom Poston, Bill Dana, Tim Conway, Dayton Allen, not one upon the other. We found Tom and Don, so we had Tom, Louie, and Don originally, and added Pat Harrington. And writing, my wife saw a show she thought was especially well written, a General Motors special, and it was head writer was Jess Oppenheim, but the two writers who worked for him were Arnie Sultan and Marvin Worth. And I called Jess, and he said, by all means, hire them. Jeff was incidentally responsible for my getting the Steve Allen show. And so I hired them. Then Larry Klein and Hal Goodman became available, and we added them. And then Bill Dana was on the late night show, and I sensed very gifted, and I liked him. And I had read the material of a writer in the NBC development program, Don Hinckley, and I put them together. And we had our writing staff. You asked earlier about how did Steve react to me. I came in, I was very greatly concerned that we have rapport, because I assumed that my reputation, the reputation that would precede me was that I was a hatchet man. Whenever there's a placement, you're going to get rid of everybody, and that wasn't my intention. I just wanted, as I indicated, to develop the show along the lines of the old Gabe Dell, Norman Abbott comedy, because the show had a kinship to it. Herb and Stan. Steve met with me and he said, I know you've done Bilko and you've done the Honeymooners, but what experience you had in variety shows? And I said, I'm going to tell you a long story. And I told him the story of developing the act for Gabe and Norman, hiring Stan and Herb, and that he had seen them. So he was immeasurably relieved. And then he was very cooperative because we had a long haul.
So those writers brought in the sensibility that you had written for Norman and Gabe.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And what I can say with hopefully passable pride is that within the 8 months, we won the time slot. We got nominated for Emmys and Writing Awards, and ultimately run the Peabody. And then enjoyed 3 glorious years in New York, where we were an NBC flagship. I think we made an error. We kept accumulating comedians until we had too many to write for. We added Jim Nabors. I said Tim Conway. I'm trying to think of Gabe Dell. So you realize when you have 7 or 8 and they're deserving of equal time, you can't possibly do the show any justice. Never were able to find a gifted woman. I felt we would have very much needed a woman. You know, the Caesar show had gone with Emma Jean Coker and Nanette Fabray. We tried Carol Burnett. We auditioned her. She was marvelous in her act, but somehow what she did at the run-through wasn't what she was equal to doing. And eventually she went on a Gary Moore show and matriculated and developed there and was superb. So our instincts were right. And Bill Dana, who kept going back to the club, trying and working with, at least they developed a relationship. They became friends. So something came out of it. Yeah.
Can you describe some of the recurring sketches?
Yeah, well, you know, Herb and Stan had originated The Man on the Street. We embellished it by creating specific characters for Don Knotts and Tom Poston. Louie Nye was already established as Gordon.
Can you
Hathaway.
describe from beginning to end how a Man on the Street would go with those actors?
Oh, I imagine I could. I assume you want me to.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yes. Steve would announce the question of the week, whatever it was. Do you think halitosis is contagious? And now we'll get the answers from Men on the Street. And here's our first, your name, sir. And Louis and I would say, I'm Gordon Hathaway. Hi-ho, Steve Areno. And he would do his uniquely conceived character, which was a cross between a Madison Avenue advertising executive and a fop out of the French Revolution. And then we come to the next man on the street, who Don Knotts, and who would have a different name each week, but he'd be very nervous and apprehensive, and invariably, hard put upon to remain in frame. And we found Noop by accident. Instead of saying no, I said to Don, I was directing the show then too, is, can we find another way of saying no? Because it's got to be a right response to, are you nervous? And Noop came out of that. And with Tom, I had the idea that I hear my hard R, my New York speech pattern. We had the idea that we'd have a man who was so terrified to be on television and be facing a camera that he atrophied. He was totally incapable of speaking. So a simple thing like, your name, sir. And the pain and anguish. And then the next question was upon him. So that they were so well etched and so beautifully performed, they worked. And then we realized these three men had enormous rapport as performers and off stage. They liked each other, they respected each other. And so we started to create departments for them. The Bureau of Standards became one, where there were three different scientific experts, and the underlying theme was they hated each other. They resented being on the same panel, but there was money involved and prestige. So they somehow would tolerate each other for the limited period of time they were on the air. Of course, you could sense the disapproval of each other, and that was part of the fun. So it didn't matter what we were testing. It was the relationship. I remember we did Roth wine, and the joke was the grapes of Roth. Playing words. I'm not a great fan of puns, but somehow that one worked. And the Strook stapler, and a great deal of pain. Louis, whatever Louis did with testing, he'd end up hurting himself, to the glee of the other two. And Louis was very skilled with pain. He was the second position to Gleason. Yes. So that was that, the Bureau Standards. We then had Huntley and Brinkley had a weekly news show, and we had Winkley, Dinkley, Blinkley, and what, I can't remember the same, but we went, the same format went around, and now you, Chet, now you, with their names, and of course none of them were well informed, and they were all confused, and the remotes were always not working. But yet we went through it pridefully, as if we had just dispensed the most important information one could receive. Then we had Steve did the sports commentator, the overzealous sports commentator, and then we created a marvelous thing for him, the question man. You gave the answer, he made up the question. We reversed a program that had been known as the Answer Man, where he had answers for every question.
Do you remember any of those?
No, no, I don't. But let me see if I can. No, I don't. We published a book of them, so I can go upstairs and find it.
What was the letter to the editor sketch?
That was Steve would read alleged letters written to the editor, but he'd read them in the tone in which they were written. So as somebody filled with vituperation, anger, hostility. So they were all, done facetiously, but in a a rancorous tone. And
They were clipped out of the newspaper?
yeah, and Steve would eventually become apoplectic. Yeah, they were clipped out of newspapers, right? I'm trying to remember. We did a series. Martha Ray became a semi-regular on the show, and we did variations on the same theme of a very competent person involved with inadequate personnel. We first did it where she's a guest on a live television show, and nobody's equal to her. The props are not where they should be. The phone rings and there's no phone on left on the set. Then she did where she went, as a star often does, goes on tour with a classic play and then picks up the local actors. And of course they'd be all incompetents and played by Louis, Tom, and Don, and Steve. And then we did it where she was a movie star. And of course, everybody around her she was of such prestige that they were woefully ill at ease and inadequate. And you would do, with the clackboard we could go so we could see we were on take 43, and the anger was in her eyes, but she had to appear docile and sweet for the audience. And there's a marvelous moment with Martha's brilliance. There's a scene cutting back and forth between her and Stephen and Martha, and he's saying, "Why did you do it, Faye?" "I don't know. Tell me, Faye. I really don't know." "You know, Faye." "No, I don't." "Come on, Faye, tell me." Okay, now the camera, and this is where the inadequate camera movement. He says, "Why'd you do it, Martha?" Faye, that was the name of it, Faye. She said, "I don't know." "Yes, you do." She says, "I really don't know." And the camera stays on her. And she says, "I really don't know." She's trying to get the camera to cut with her eyes. It was brilliant. So that was the fun of working with a majestic talent such as hers. The other departments, we eventually introduced Bill Dana as Jose Jimenez on one show, and that took off. That was a Howard Report to the Nation. What we did is use a great deal of Sunday programming as our target. All those allegedly erudite shows were marvelous fodder for us, or something like Report to the Nation or You Are There. Jose Jimenez was presented as the first time as he ran a Santa Claus school, and on the board was written J-O, J-O. And he said, "Pardon me, but what is that?" He says, "Ho, ho." Now, how that character came about is kind of fascinating.
Let's get that up when we get done. The next tape.